Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. It was a gray Sunday, like all the others for the past 3 years. But that gray, that morning, seemed denser, heavier, almost thick in the air. A pale mist rose between the stones of Fairhill Cemetery, winding around the crosses, the statues of angels, the silent mausoleums like a memory that refuses to disappear. Richard Donovan walked slowly, his steady steps barely echoing on the wet gravel. He wasn't as upright as he once was, his shoulders hunched, his gait cautious, as if each step toward his son's grave weighed a little more than the last. At 68, he wore the elegance of a great American businessman, but faded by loneliness and the wear and tear of mourning. He was dressed, as he did every Sunday, in a sober, tailored black suit, without a tie. He hadn't worn a tie since the funeral. It was strangling him, he said. In her left hand, held firmly despite her gnarled fingers, a bouquet of white lilies. Always the same. Julian's mother's favorite flowers. A silent gesture to remind us that all 3 of them had existed once upon a time. The air smelled of damp stone, dead leaves, and a faint scent of wet fur. A light breeze occasionally blew through the bare branches, rustling the faded wreaths hanging from the graves. Around him, the world seemed frozen, as if time, out of respect or cruelty, had decided to slow down every time he crossed that wrought iron gate. He reached the cemetery's central aisle, where the Donovans had been buried for 3 generations, a line of builders, bankers, inventors. But none of it made sense to him anymore. His tech empire could continue to grow, his investments could multiply. There was no replacement for Julian. Julian, her only son, 17 years old. A lively intelligence, a mischievous smile, his mother's eyes. A promise for the future, cut down by a drunk driver on a wet road, one ordinary Saturday night. The day before, they'd had a fight. A silly argument about going out with friends. Richard still blamed himself for those words he'd said too loudly, and for those he hadn't had time to say. He stopped abruptly. Someone was already there. About 20 paces ahead of him, a boy sat cross-legged, his back bent, as if in prayer. He wasn't moving. He was talking. He was whispering. Richard frowned. No one ever came to this grave except him. There was a kind of silent respect, or perhaps fear. But this boy seemed familiar with the place. Intimate even. He approached slowly, his heart heavy and troubled. The boy's face was thin, hollow, marked by a fatigue known only to street children. His pants were too big, his jacket threadbare. His backpack had a broken zipper and an old Red Sox patch half torn off. He didn't seem to notice the man approaching. Until Richard speaks. "Excuse me," he said in a hoarse, almost timid voice. You know Julian?" The boy jumped, spinning on his heels, ready to flee like a startled animal. His eyes, large and dark, stared into Richard's with sudden panic. "I'm sorry, sir," he said quickly, "that I didn't mean to disturb. I'm going to leave." He stood up so quickly that his bag fell to the floor. Richard raised a calming hand. "Attends." There was a softness in his voice, something worn, but sincere. "Do you come here often?" The boy hesitated, his eyes shifting, his jaw clenched. Then he nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. Every Sunday. For almost a year." "But why? Why this grave?" "My son's." The silence stretched on, broken only by a gust of wind that stirred leaves around them. Then, in a barely audible voice, the boy answered. "I don't know. The first time, I was just lost. I had nothing. I needed to talk to someone, and I saw this grave. He was almost my age. Julian. It struck me. He was 17, I was 12. I felt like he would understand. So I spoke, and I kept coming." Richard felt his heart clench. His breath caught. The wind seemed to stop for a moment. This boy, this complete stranger, had been coming for a year to talk to his son, like him. Grief had no blood connection here, only a shared solitude. Julian's image was superimposed on the teenager's face for a moment. A fleeting but moving illusion. He held out his hand. "Richard Donovan." The boy hesitated, then shook the outstretched hand with embarrassment mixed with curiosity. Tyler Brooks." It was a discreet handshake, but one that changed 2 destinies. As the weeks passed, a strange habit took hold. Every Sunday, without a word being exchanged on the subject, Richard and Tyler would meet in front of Julian's grave. It had become a kind of silent ritual, fragile and sacred, as if the simple act of sharing this space of pain connected them. Fairhill Cemetery, with its ancient stone paths and ancient trees, became their meeting point. Autumn had given way to a harsh winter, then to the uncertain thaw of spring. Time passed, the seasons changed, but Sundays remained. Unwavering. At first, they exchanged little more than awkward greetings. Sometimes Richard would place his flowers, stand silently, and then leave without a word. Tyler, on the other hand, always sat cross-legged, whispering to Julian, as if confiding his secrets. This shared silence was their language. But little by little, the ice melted. One Sunday, Richard handed him a steaming cup. Hot chocolate. Do you want some? Tyler hesitated, eyed him suspiciously, then took the cup with a nod. That simple gesture opened a breach. Another day, Tyler arrived with a pair of old, broken headphones he'd repaired all by himself. He shyly showed them to Richard, as proud as a little craftsman. I like to tinker with things, he said. I found this in a dumpster. Richard, impressed, listened to him speak for 10 minutes without interrupting. It was the first time Tyler had ever been so animated. It was in these small moments that Richard began to understand. Tyler was living in a foster home in Roxbury, a neighborhood ravaged by poverty, violence, and neglect. There was nothing stable in his life. He moved from bed to bed, from counselor to counselor, always in transit, always waiting for something better that never came. His mother had died of an overdose when he was 9. His father was serving a long sentence for robbery. Since then, he had been floating through the system, invisible. One Sunday, as they sat on an old stone bench, surrounded by the distant croaking of crows, Richard asked her a simple question. "In school?" Tyler shrugged. "I'll go, yeah? But what's the point? I'll end up like everyone else where I come from. On the street. Or in jail. I'm not cut out for good things." He looked at the floor as he spoke, as if apologizing for existing. Richard felt a lump form in his throat. He had seen so many powerful men, so many brilliant minds in his industry, but never had he heard such raw lucidity in the voice of a teenager. "Do you think Julian would say that?" he asked. Tyler shrugged again. "I don't know. But he had a father, a home, a future. He knew what he wanted." Richard closed his eyes for a moment. He would have given his entire empire, until his last breath, to see Julian again, even for a minute. Even if he was poor, even if he was lost. He inhaled slowly, then said in a calm voice, "Maybe you're the one who's still here to do what he didn't have time to do." The words hung in the air for a long time. Tyler didn't answer, but he heard them. They stayed with him all week, like a riddle. And then, one Sunday, as a cold wind blew through the leafless trees, after a long shared silence, Richard made a decision. He slowly turned his head towards Tyler. "Listen, Tyler, if you want, I can help you. With school. With a more stable place. With a chance, at least. Not a promise of happiness. Just a chance." Tyler jumped slightly. He tensed. "Why would you do that? I'm nobody to you." Richard met her gaze, without hesitation. "You're a boy who talks to my son when I can't anymore. And I think Julian would have loved you. So maybe I can love you too. In my own way." He didn't say the last word aloud, but she was there, hanging there. This was the beginning. Richard began the long, complex administrative process. He confronted social services, judges, and psychologists. He called on his lawyers, not to manipulate the system, but to give him another chance. First, he obtained temporary custody. He installed Tyler in a converted wing of his Back Bay house, not too close, not too far. With his own bed, a desk, a bedside lamp he could turn on when he wanted to read. Richard didn't want to invade him, only anchor him. He enrolled him in a private school that accepted struggling students with a tutoring program. He hired a therapist who specialized in adolescent trauma. He enrolled Tyler in robotics and boxing classes. Not to change him, just to give him a choice. Tyler resisted at first. He tested the boundaries, sometimes insolent, sometimes silent. He expected Richard to abandon him at the first misstep. But Richard remained. One evening, Tyler left a graded math homework lying around. He'd gotten a B+. Richard didn't say anything immediately, but he discreetly slipped a small medal into his toolbox. "Well done. Keep going. RD. Tyler found it, and kept it. As the months passed, a strange, improbable, and true relationship developed. Richard wasn't trying to replace Julian. He was still talking to his grave, but he learned to look at Tyler differently. to laugh at his jokes, to listen to his silences, to place a reassuring hand on his shoulder on days of doubt. As for Tyler, he gradually stopped walking with his shoulders hunched. He raised his head. He learned to cook pancakes on Sunday mornings. He dared to ask questions. He began to dream again. And one day he called Richard not Sir, but Richard. Then, much later, one stormy evening, in a low voice, almost without meaning to, he said, "Thanks, board." And that word was worth all the silence in the world. The years passed, like pages gently turned in a precious book. Tyler grew, matured, and changed. His gaze became more assured, his voice more measured, his stride more grounded. This boy from the streets of Roxbury, battered by life, became a brilliant, determined young man, driven by a clear vision to repair the world he had seen crack beneath his childhood feet. He discovered a passion for architecture and urban planning, not to build tall skyscrapers or cold, prestigious buildings, but to restore dignity to forgotten neighborhoods. He wanted to rebuild the streets of his past, to provide safe homes for children who, like him once, fell asleep in fear and emptiness. While studying at Boston Architectural College, he worked tirelessly. He drew late into the night, racked up internships, and participated in community projects. He sometimes returned to Roxbury, not as a tourist, but as a brother. He listened to people. He noted what was missing, what was hurting, what could be reborn. On his 22nd birthday, something powerful and unexpected happened. He was chosen to deliver the commencement address. The large lecture hall at Boston Architectural College was packed. Families, friends, professors, and students. And in the front row, sitting upright despite the weight of his years, was Richard Donovan, elegant in his midnight blue suit, his hands clasped in his lap, his eyes moist. Tyler took the stage, dressed in a simple suit. He paused before speaking. His gaze swept the room, then rested briefly on Richard. He took a deep breath. "It all started on a grave," he said, his voice trembling. A murmur ran through the room. "I was 14. I had nothing. No home, no hope, no connection. I was talking to a boy I'd never met. A boy buried under a gray stone in a quiet corner of Boston. And that boy, Julian, gave me a father." He paused. His eyes were wet, but he didn't look away. "I am here today because a man believed in me. Because he didn't ask me who I was, but who I wanted to become. Because he didn't run away from my pain, but recognized it. He offered me a roof over my head, a listening ear, an outstretched hand. He didn't want to save me. He wanted me to save myself, and he stayed, every day, to help me." He took another breath, his voice louder. "I am living proof that love can rise from the ashes of grief. That even the most painful loss can become a starting point. Julian is dead, yes. But through him, a bond was born. A bond that changed my life." A vibrant silence filled the room. Then, slowly, the applause began. But only one man, standing there with trembling hands, clapped louder than all the others. Richard Donovan. That day, they didn't say much as they left. But in the silent embrace they exchanged, there was everything that words cannot say. Years later, Richard died peacefully in his home, a book on his lap. He had lived, loved, suffered, and loved again. Until the very end. At his side, Tyler held his hand. He didn't cry right away. He stayed there for a long time, in silence, as he had once done on that cemetery bench. A few months later, a new plaque was installed on the family grave. Simple, elegant. It reflected the story of 3 lives linked beyond blood. Julian Donovan, 1999 to 2016. The one who listened even after life. Richard Donovan, 1956 to 2040. The one who knew how to love again. And, at the bottom, engraved in discreet letters, like a murmur of eternal gratitude. Tyler Brooks. The son he chose. And in this cemetery where it all began, the silence was no longer sad. It was full of memory, love, and gratitude.